elections. We began in May 2021, but at that time we were focused mostly on blockchains. Now we have broadened our scope considerably. One Vote is hosted at HasGeek, which is a platform for collaborations across practices surrounding technology, design, law, systems, data, privacy, and other topics.
We began in May 2021, but at that time we were focused.
Sorry, I could hear myself.
Carry
Right.
on.
These sessions are designed to enable participants to acquire the foundational knowledge and perspectives required to evaluate the intended and unintended consequences of technology. This series is being done in collaboration with the Jindal School of Journalism. And for the audience, if you wish to speak, please use the raise hand function and you will be called upon. Or you can put your questions in the chat box on Zoom. Or if you're joining us from YouTube, please put your chats there and we'll be monitoring that. We welcome Nitin Sethi and Jagdeep Chokar. And now I will hand this over to Professor Bhattacharjee.
Thanks, Chantal. Hello and welcome to Fight for Democracy. It's a series during the ongoing elections in India to focus and discuss on some critical aspects of electioneering, and the previous episodes that we've done out here on One Vote, hosted at HasGeek in collaboration with Jindal School of Journalism and Communication at OP Jindal Global University, were criminality and politics and data. And today we are going to discuss electoral bonds, transparency. Words that have entered our lexicon, but a lot of people are still not very clear of what it really means. What are electoral bonds? Why is electoral bonds controversial? Now, these are the questions that will be answered. Joining me is Nitin Sethi, a journalist, and he's a member of the Reporters Collective. The collective reports and investigates the functioning of Indian political economy. And the electoral bonds investigation was one such. The collective reports in multiple languages, which is very important and very encouraging, and formats throughout collaborations across platforms and sectoral expertise. He was also a partner at Land Conflict Watch, which is India's largest data-based research outfit, comprising of lawyers, researchers, and journalists who systematically document land and resource conflicts in India. And I have known Nitin for a very long time, and anything to do with environment reporting. Nitin was one of the most credible voices, investigative reporting, and he's been there around for a fairly long time. Jagdeep Chokar, a professor, teacher, trainer, researcher, advisor of management and organizational behavior at the IIM Ahmedabad from 1985 to 2006, till the time he retired. And he's a citizen activist for improving democracy and governance in the country, a bird watcher, and a conservationist, which probably brings him close, has some commonality with Nitin out here as well. Nitin is also a keen photographer, and in many ways a conservationist in his conservation activism. And Dr. Chokar is also a trained lawyer. Before becoming a professor, he was an engineer manager with the Indian Railways and worked as an international marketing manager for 4 years. But he is here today because he's also the founding member of the Association of Democratic Reforms, ADR, an organization that now very well known across the country for improving or for encouraging or for investigating, for promoting transparency in elections. Welcome, Nitin and Dr. Chokar. Anything in India is really big. Like the big fat Indian wedding, we also have the big expensive Indian elections. 2014, we were told, was a most expensive election ever in India. And then 2019 came, and 2014 seemed like nothing. I mean, I don't know what the exact amount would be. There were extrapolated figures, which I wouldn't like to mention out here because we will never know for certain what it would be, but it's a whopping amount of money that was spent in Indian elections. Now, where does this money come from? How do political parties raise funding? Now, in 2017, I think in the finance bill, something was introduced that was called electoral bonds. And in 2019, it got notified, and then we had the 2019 elections. Now, if I may request Nitin, who has investigated on electoral bonds, to lay out this terrain, as it were, Nitin, to explain what is this bond about? Why is it so controversial? Why is it called scam within quotes?
Sure. Thanks, Kishle and Shant, for having me here today. Going by a cue, I'll try and introduce the basic logic of what electoral bonds is, and perhaps towards the end, suggest why it's raised such a stink about how it functions. The then Finance Minister Arun Jaitley introduced the idea and the notion of electoral bonds under the Finance Act. His claim at that time, and the government's claim at that time, was that this was being done to bring transparency to how political parties get funded in India. To one part, he was right at that time, that electoral funding in India for many years and decades has been a dark hole. A lot of cash moves around in elections. And as Kishle rightly said, it's very difficult to pin down and say how much gets spent, because a lot of money gets spent off the balance sheet, as they say. Mr. Jaitley and the BJP government under Narendra Modi, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, introduced the idea saying this would bring transparency because money would move through bank accounts into political parties. It was quite clear to most people, I think, who understood electoral funding from day one, that in the name of transparency, what was being introduced was perhaps a very dangerous instrument that would allow unaccounted for money to move from unknown people into political parties' coffers without us as citizens knowing who's giving and donating how much to the political parties. The government also introduced other amendments to the laws which did two really dangerous things. One, it allowed indirectly foreign entities, people sitting outside and companies sitting outside the boundaries of India, to also donate through their subsidiaries to Indian political parties, something which had been banned till now, and for good reasons, as we all understand. They brought about another amendment which allowed shell companies that exist on registers, on government registers, but who do nothing, who earn not a penny if they don't want. The government allowed these companies to also provide anonymously and secretly infinite amount of money to political parties, which meant you could float a company whose real ownership is unknown to all of us, a company that produces nothing, earns zero, but yet is able to donate hundreds of crores secretively to political parties. This is a standard route that otherwise is known as the Hawala racket or the black money scamming routes, which the same government has claimed it would try to stop when it came into power in 2014. Put together, this scheme, to my mind, did one thing. It did create a channel through banking accounts to transfer money to political parties. But it also used the confusion in the minds that was used in the demonetization era to make people unclear about what is black money, as we call it in India. In US, it's called dark money. Black money is not money which is given in cash to each other. It's money which is unaccounted for or untaxed, and people cannot make out where it's coming from, how it's been earned, and whether who really owns that money. I apologize for some background noise. I'm living in a joint family, and we'll have to suffer some of my cousins and the chicken once in a while. So the government did use bank accounts and mandate that the money should move through bank accounts, but it passed amendments to different laws which made sure none of us as citizens will ever come to know who's donated the amount to which political party. I could literally go to a bank, in this case, the State Bank of India, buy out what would be, in other terms, a bearer check in some ways, where I don't have to say who I'm going to give this money to. I'll take it as an IOU or a certificate or a promissory note, as it's called in economics, and hand it over to X person. X could hand it over to Y, and Y could eventually hand it over to a political party. By the end of it, there would be no way of tracing who actually bought it and who actually got it. The political parties were mandated under the amended laws not to report where they had got the bonds from, only to say how much aggregate bond amount they've got in a particular annual financial year. The corporates were not required now to also report who they had funded. They were technically expected to, in their annual reports, present that they have spent some money on political funding. But considering there are lakhs and lakhs of companies in India, no one would ever be able to dig out which shell company in which part of India was used to divert funds to political parties. This was the crux as it started off. We at the Reporters Collective, through RTI, along with Commodore Lokesh Batra, brought out documents, government documents through RTI, which showed that the scheme had been floated by the government despite vehement opposition by the Reserve Bank of India, which very categorically said that this would bring in black money into Indian politics. It would be unaccountable for. It went ahead to say it would bring foreign influence into politics, as well as create a separate form of currency in some sense, which could destabilize Indian economy if it grew and bloated, as it has been bloating ever since it was floated. The Election Commission, which is the statutory and the constitutional authority to regulate elections and electoral spending, said exactly the same and said it twice over. They were overruled. The government on its records created a pretense as if they had consulted others and experts. But as we found out through these documents and reported over 10 parts, the government had actually gone aside and created a mythology that they had consulted both political parties and these constitutional authorities and the Reserve Bank of India to have what they claim to be a transparent system. As the results came out, we know of at least the first round, and we know by logic of most rounds by which these electoral bonds have gone to political parties, that a large amount of this money does go to the party in power. And the logic is rather simple. The only entity which is able to monitor who's collecting the money and where it's going is the government itself, because it oversees this operation in the State Bank of India. And it has kept an audit trail to know who donates and to which party. Clearly, the fear itself of a government in power punishing somebody for not or for giving money to opposition parties has ensured that a large percentage, and when I say large, I mean upwards of 90%, goes to party in power, in this case, the BJP. I'll stop here because I think at the moment just exploring what this electoral bonds is for colleagues who are here and did not know the more internal basics of it. And if Kishle later points out, he'll come back to critique of what it really means for democratic processes as well as electoral funding in India.
Thanks, Nitin. Yeah, this is like a primer in electoral bonds. But if I can bring in Dr. Chokar now, and the obvious question, Dr. Chokar, is that, you know, elections were fought before 2018 and elections will be fought in future. Elections have always been fought with money, which has not been transparent at any point of time. There were allegations, I remember, in the late 90s and 2000, that the amount that whichever the party was in power, months before, a year before elections, would ensure that the development funds were released, and part of the development fund would be siphoned back. But these are all allegations, never really corroborated. But you know, it was like in India, we know a lot of things which we don't corroborate, but we almost believe them with certainty. I think most voters in India have a sense of, you know, complacency about the fact that, yeah, the political parties are well funded, they are corrupt, etc., etc. Now, when you started the ADR, and it's been very bipartisan, and it's been following a certain pattern that you've kind of set for ADR and when the electoral bonds came, what were the challenges that you met in trying to promote transparency, trying to investigate transparency?
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya. I will perhaps confine myself to electoral bonds and leave out the other challenges that ADR faced over the last 23 years. The budget speech of the Finance Minister, late Mr. Arun Jaitley, was on the 1st of February 2017. Now, in that budget speech, there was a separate section consisting of 2 paragraphs, which was titled Transparency in Electoral Funding. So first of all, anybody who saw the title or heard the title was very pleased that there are going to be transparency in electoral funding or political funding. And my good friend, Dr. Qureshi, who was the Chief Election Commissioner earlier, always makes a point of saying that when he heard the Finance Minister say that for the last 70 years, we have not been able to find a way to make political and electoral funding transparent, he said, this was like music to my ears. It was a little dramatic. But the first paragraph said what has been wrong and why nothing has been possible. And the second paragraph said what is going to be done. And what was going to be done was that a new instrument called electoral bond will be introduced. It will be sold only by the State Bank of India, and it will be given to political parties who will have to deposit it in a pre-designated account. And it has to be done within 15 days, and so on and so forth. And this will ensure transparency, as Mr. Nitin Sethi said. It will go through banking channels. So far so good. Now, there is a tradition, or there was a tradition, it is that in the morning, the Finance Minister will present the budget in the Parliament. And in the afternoon, he or she would hold a informal briefing session with the media. Now, in that media session at about 3:30 in the afternoon, Mr. Jaitley said a few things about electoral bonds, and when people asked him a little more, he actually uttered this sentence. He said, the bonds will be in the nature of bearer bonds. The identity of the donor will be anonymous. So it was, when I read this in the morning the next day on the 2nd of February in the papers, that this is what he said. From that day, I have been on a quest to find out a dictionary which tells me that transparency and anonymity are synonymous. Because as far as I understand, anything which is anonymous is not transparent, and anything which is transparent is not anonymous. But we had this, I shouldn't be saying so, he is no more, may God rest his soul in peace. He was a very bright person, but he had this, and he was also a very, very good lawyer. So he was able to say this, that anonymity of the donor will be ensured, but transparency will also be ensured. Anyway, once the budget documents came through and one read through them, it was discovered that, there were going to be changes to 4 laws: the Reserve Bank of India Act, the Income Tax Act, the Companies Act, and the Representation of People Act. Now, each of these amendments were very, very significant. And when one read into the fine print, let me give you a couple of examples. The Companies Act had a provision that any company only a company which has made profits over the last 3 years can donate not more than 7.5% of its profits to political parties in 1 year. Not more than 7.5%. One change in the company law removed this limit of 7.5%, which meant that now there was no limit. And that is why Nitin said that a company could donate any amount of money without even making a penny of profit. Number one. The second amendment in the Companies Act was that any company donating to a political party had to declare the name of the political party and the amount donated. This requirement was also completely removed. Now, on the face of it, it is a line. Section 1.24 of the Companies Act should read as follows, or this portion is replaced by this. But when you look into the details, this is the kind of thing you find. Now, the amendment of the Reserve Bank of India Act and the Representation of People Act were similar. As Nitin said, not in some detail, the Reserve Bank of India is the only institution authorized to issue exchangeable instruments like currency notes, that you can give it to A to B and there is no record, there is no identification. Any other instrument has some record. So the Reserve Bank of India said that these bonds will become like currency, and therefore they will lead to generation of black money, infusion of shady capital, creation of shell companies, and so on. Similarly, the Election Commission of India said that this will make funding even more opaque, and therefore it will make the already uneven playing field even more uneven. Now, Reserve Bank of India and Election Commission of India are not to be taken lightly. They are constitutional authorities. They exist because they figure in the Constitution, and they are supposed to be theoretically under the Constitution, independent of the government. And the noting on the files that Commodore Batra got access to through RTI, and which Nitin and his colleagues reported very well, show that the Finance Secretary writes on the file that I have explained this to the Governor and Deputy Governor of the RBI, and they had not understood the scheme earlier. Now they have understood. And the election commissioners also were kind of confused, and I clarified. These are amazing things that happened. As a matter of fact, one of the most fundamental things that is wrong with the electoral bonds is that they are completely unconstitutional, because they were introduced as a part of the budget. Now, a budget falls under the category of what is called a money bill. In the Constitution, there is a definition of a money bill, and which is that the money bill deals with any expenditure from the Consolidated Fund of India, broadly speaking. Now, Consolidated Fund of India is a fund by which the Government of India, from which all expenditure of the government is done. In the case of electoral bond, the State Bank of India sells the bond to XYZ, a person or a company or whoever. There is no Consolidated Fund of India. The buyer of the bond pays money, and the SBI gives her or him a piece of paper. Then this person goes and gives this piece of paper to X, Y, or Z, and it finally lands up in the bank account of a political party. There is no connection whatsoever with the Consolidated Fund of India. Therefore, electoral bond do not or cannot fall under the definition of a money bill. So putting them in the money bill was for a reason. The government of the day had a majority in the Lok Sabha, but they did not have a majority in the Rajya Sabha. No. They did not have a majority in the Rajya Sabha, but still a money bill has to be passed in the Lok Sabha, like any other bill, then it is sent to the Rajya Sabha. Whereas Rajya Sabha can make amendments, etc., to any other bill, but a money bill can be only discussed by the Rajya Sabha, and they can make observations. They cannot withhold its passage. So therefore, to avoid the problem or avoid problems in the Rajya Sabha, they put it in the money bill that even if people object, it will still pass. So it is unconstitutional. It goes against all tenets of transparency that the Supreme Court has been saying about elections and about there being a level playing field. And as Nitin explained, it happened in the very first week that it was discovered that if only the State Bank of India knows who is buying electoral bonds and nobody else knows, and the scheme says that the State Bank of India not tell anybody unless somebody comes with a court order in a criminal case. Now, and that the State Bank of India will collect KYC, know your customer details. If the State Bank of India is not to share this with anybody, then why collect it? But what we know is that State Bank of India cannot hide any information from the Finance Ministry. And once the Finance Ministry knows that somebody is buying these bonds, it is very simple and light-heartedly I say that, the State Bank of India main branch in the Parliament Street, somebody buys electoral bond worth 2 crores and gets into his car and starts driving towards Akbar Road. And those who are familiar with Delhi will know that Akbar Road has the headquarters of the Congress Party. And from Parliament Street, as you are going towards Akbar Road, you pass through 2 or 3 roundabouts. And on one of those roundabouts, you get a phone call. How are you doing, Professor Kishle Bhattacharjee? How I am doing well. And the person says, I am so-and-so. If I were at Professor Bhattacharjee's place, I would start sweating right there. And if I am not, I am still more robust, he will say, I am doing all right. So this person says, so I believe you have bought electoral bond for 2 crores. And Professor Bhattacharjee says, yes. Then he says, so which party are you thinking of giving it to? That is enough. And the person will turn his car towards the Ashokar, which is the headquarters of the BJP. So the bonds, given the structure, have the
I think, Dr. Chokar, you've muted yourself by mistake.
The electoral bonds through this process had the potential of choking the funding to all opposition parties except the ruling party. And this would happen regardless of which the ruling party is. And this is the carrot which was hung before opposition parties. None of the opposition parties opposed it tooth and nail. There were very mild opposition noises in the parliament. But finally, after ADR had filed a petition in the Supreme Court, one of the political parties has also filed a petition, I must say that. But most political parties felt, just to be a little irreverent, there was a film which said, Apna number aayega. They thought that when they are in political power somewhere in some state, they will also reap this harvest of electoral votes. So it is a very insidious scheme. And then once the scheme came into place, strange things happened. the scheme said it is only for Lok Sabha elections. After the introduction, after the Lok Sabha election in 2019, came the Karnataka election. And all of a sudden, an order was issued to make an exception this one time and open a window for the Karnataka election. Now that one-time exception has now become the rule. In every state assembly election, electoral bonds are sold, which is against the scheme as it was formulated by the government itself. So, you are violating rules you make yourself when they suit you. There is no accountability whatsoever. And we can see that one political party seems to have got almost all the money available. And in the ADR also puts out things about, the donation political parties got and so on, their assets and their wealth. This time it was interesting that the party with the highest wealth was BJP, and the party at number 2 was not the Congress. It was BSP. So the financial stature of parties is undergoing a significant change, and all this is happening under the invisible hand of the ruling party. And as has been said in the petitions in the court and elsewhere, this is an absolute confirmed recipe for Indian politics and Indian democracy to be controlled by money, whether Indian money or foreign money, whether legitimate money or drug money or anything else. So this is, as I said in some other discussion, that it will not be a Loktantra, it will be a Dhantantra. So if our democracy gets to be controlled by money which comes from anywhere, then we can imagine what is going to happen. This has implications for national security. It has implications for all kinds of things. And therefore, to my mind, this is a very, very serious danger to democracy in a very fundamental way. And the Supreme Court of India, we filed this petition in 2017. The first substantial hearing was held in 2019, April 12. And the 3-judge bench headed by the Chief Justice of that time actually wrote in their order that the pleadings raised by both sides have raise weighty issues which impact the entire electoral and political system in the country. Now, weighty issues are waiting, and it has now been 5 years. Nothing has happened. Elections have come and elections have gone. Electoral bonds are being sold, and something like 70 to 80% go to the ruling party. And this is what we think is a democracy in which we are living. So electoral bonds are one of the most dangerous features that have been introduced for democracy, and we must fight against it as best as we can. Otherwise, we can start worshipping Mammon, and that's it. I'll stop here for the time being.
Thank you, Dr. Chokar. We'll obviously have to come back to you. At this point, I'm going to ask the audience on our YouTube live streaming to please type your questions, and the others who are out here on the Zoom platform also to have your questions ready. Nitin, Dr. Chokar has laid out the pitfalls of what electoral bonds would be, but if you can also add that what are the consequences of this black/dark money? I mean, we know that through RTI applications that roughly around 10,000 crores of bonds probably were purchased since 2018. correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't think so. We know who contributed that. There was also a report that that each bond has a almost invisible alphanumeric invisible code. What does that code actually do? I mean, and why is that every bond has a different code if that is a safety code which the government claims to be? But also, if you can tell us the consequences. Dr. Chokar mentions drug funding. I was thinking of the terror funding, because the terror funding seems to be a very favorite term for many governments, because they can run after politicians or civilians or any citizens of this country, alleging or charging them of being involved in terror funding. But this seems to be a more fit case for such opaque funding, right?
Yes. So let me start by giving an analogy instead, and a principle of what electoral politics ought to be like in a democracy. The basic notion of electoral politics in democracy is that we as citizens elect people to not govern us, but to run the society on our behalf. They're supposed to be our public servants. The logic is that they should therefore only be answerable to us, citizens who vote. Therefore, it's not companies or NGOs or trusts that vote, but only citizens who vote. But what happens in case you and I and everyone here puts one vote each out of however 70 million, etc. votes we have? But instead, a company or an individual comes and behind closed doors hands over 1,000 crores to a political party and says, hey, here's my donation. Now, it seems nice. I mean, maybe the company or entity we don't know of wants to really support democracy in some way and believes in the ideology of a party. Fairly so. It's quite possible. But I come to think of it, either you or I who earn whatever amount we earn, if we're going to put a third of our income or even a tenth of our income and give it to somebody, a political party, logically, we would expect it to deliver something against that amount. There's no other reason. A company is supposed to make profits. So if it's donating some amount to a political party, it clearly intends to reap some profits out of it. The profit would clearly come in terms of, if elected, that politician rendering certain policies in favor of a corporate entity, changing rules and laws that govern businesses, industries. It takes simple tweaks to say certain goods will get less tax, certain goods which are imported, which compete with my goods, will get more taxed. There's infinite play available for a government to favor different corporates and their business interests. And clearly, if I'm going to invest 1,000 crores in a political party, I would like to reap at least 5,000 crores in the next 5 years out of it. Because for me, it's a political and business investment I'm making in the political party. And the government who has taken this money would have to tweak the laws, rules, regulations, and business channels to make sure that that benefit is returned to that entity. Clearly, that party is then not functioning for its citizens' interests. It is functioning for interests of one or two entities or more entities that secretly provide them funds. Now, in classical corruption, this is what's called crony capitalism, right? That you quietly change rules. You don't break rules, but you change the rules and you change the laws to quietly favor somebody who's done you some favor. Now, what electoral bonds does is turn crony capitalism legal in India. Because now it's under law that you can secretly provide funds to a political party. And we will never come to know as citizens who funded these political parties for what benefits that they got eventually. We've seen enough. I mean, I and my team at Reporters Collective as investigative journalists keep digging out these little scams, big scams of worth 6,400 crores, 10,000 crores. And we've seen this in all governments. These are merely symptoms of what is crony capitalism. We are able to catch the fever. The essence of this disease is this black, opaque electoral funding, which used to exist earlier, as you and Professor Chokar both pointed out correctly. But at least on paper, by law, it was illegal till then. Now you've sanctified it by law and said this is how our electoral politics will run. Legally, foreign entities, foreign companies having clearly some business in India will be able to pay political parties without us as citizens knowing where that money came from. This is a second-degree challenge that this provides to the nature of, particularly, I feel, Indian politics. One of the uniqueness of Indian electoral politics has been the emergence of very diverse voices of communities that were historically disenfranchised or discriminated against. And those communities being able to come forth into politics by creating new small formations and change the nature of our democracy, make it relatively better. What electoral funding does of this kind is deny them that equitous right to also collect funds. But clearly, as Dr. Chokar was saying, the largest party in power will always attract like a magnet most of this money. And you will deny it to new emerging parties, which otherwise have a very small base, but had it been a transparent process, they would have possibly got more. So it also over time debilitates for our democracy the basic fundamental requirement that we provide equitous space in our political spheres to smaller emerging political parties from different corners. Imagine a small Dalit party emerging, say in Bihar or UP or Tamil Nadu, wherever else, a unit which is led by Dalit leaders wanting to collect funds. It's near impossible for them now to collect funds from this route because here you have a political party in power which will make sure it doesn't. Which brings me to the question you asked about the secret number on the so-called electoral bond, which my friend and colleague Poonam discovered and reported on at Quint at that time. She now works with us. That number is basically the government's way of tracking who is buying the bond and which party is getting the bond. And it's fairly logical. If you have a check, I'm sure, these days we wire transfer money, but those of us who remember checks, every check had a unique identity number because fairly, as a bank which is dealing with these amounts, will have to say on my record, who put the money there and where did the money go? It will have to have a bank audit trail of where the money goes. That number was put on the electoral bonds to ensure the State Bank of India can then trace where the money comes from and where it goes. Records that Commodore Lokesh Patran we brought out clearly showed there was a great deliberation in the government before the electoral bonds were floated to say, yes, we do need this special feature. The SBI insisted without this, it cannot function. The RBI had completely opposed it. The government bypassed the RBI by setting up the SBI to do its dirty work. Clearly, because the SBI, as we know, anyone who's covered the finance ministry and finances of Indian banking system, the SBI is a government bank. Everyone in that bank is selected and positioned by the government. It responds to the government's instructions on various schemes and how it runs its finance. Unfortunately, even at times of who it gives loans to. The records show, as Dr. Chokar was talking on that incident, where these immoral laws or rules, if I may call them, said that electoral bond should only be floated just before general elections for Lok Sabha. It was the Prime Minister's office which sent instructions to break that rule that it had passed and allow electoral bonds to be marketed out, sold and purchased during general state elections like Karnataka and others. It was the Finance Ministry which instructed the State Bank, again the same documents show, which said, oh, these bonds are about to expire, please use them in this and that fashion. We've seen correspondence where the State Bank of India was almost on a daily basis corresponding with the Finance Ministry, telling them what's happening with the electoral bond scheme. It's the most insidious idea. The fact that I think sometimes I wonder whether we failed as journalists to talk about it in a better fashion. You're setting the fundamentals of democracy at, as Dr. Chokar said, at great risk. You're setting up a mechanism that any political party in power will have no incentive to change once you set us rolling down this hill. There has been, as I keep saying, It's never been that Indian electoral politics and electoral funding has been clean. But at least till this happened, we had a veneer that it was illegal. There was hope that you could move up the ladder and bring better reforms that would make it better. We've set ourselves decades back, I think. We've set ourselves back to an era where, you would have a king who would take favors and then do things that needed to be done to deliver. We moved far away from the nature of democracy we needed to move towards. It's so unique that no other known democracy in the world follows this pattern. We are uniquely corrupt and legally corrupt now in how electoral funding is practiced. And its consequences are seen in our daily lives. It's not I would think, it's not an abstract idea. It's not a distant idea from us as citizens. This is when governments come elected in this manner, that they will render things which are not in our favor, which were not meant for average citizens' benefits. Thousands of crores worth of benefits would be provided to small corporates, unknown corporates as profits, at the cost of us as citizens and taxpayers, and everyone pays tax. It's not just the middle class, remember. Indirect taxes are paid disproportionately more by the poor than the rich. Our money is being diverted into the hands of corporates as profits as a return on this investment that the corporates make from inside and outside India as electoral bonds. And there can be nothing more insidious than that. And as an investigative journalist, sometimes you think your entire business of investigative journalism is silly, because all we're going to keep catching for the rest of our lives most often are these cases of corruption, which is simply a symptom of how bad electoral funding is, and its inevitable end of this kind of electoral funding.
Thanks, Nitin. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that as journalists, since you mentioned that we have not done what we could have done, should have done, we should have done better. But this raises this question in my mind, that is the voter really concerned about where the political party is getting its money from? And I use an analogy out here is that, having worked in a network for 20 years, raising questions to politicians and to various other investigating stories, you have been there as well with legacy media. I wasn't really bothered about who was sponsoring us. Still a very, very much later did we ask these questions, that why is Vedanta suddenly sponsoring a series on the girl child? Or why is Dettol sponsoring a series on Swachh Bharat? So is the voter really concerned? I mean, on one hand, transparency should be there, and democracy should have transparency. But I'm just asking, is that something that you've encountered?
I have no doubt, Kishle. I know most journalists become skeptics as they go grey. I've become more optimist. I actually believe citizens are really bothered about it. That they don't have a handle on it and they're not able to grapple with it is fair, because they spend much of their lives just earning their basic livelihoods, considering how poor a large percentage of India is. But therefore, they put people like you and me in these positions to help ask these questions in the correct time, in the correct way, and the loudest possible way. In all my 2 decades of journalism, I've never felt that any citizen was not aware that there is great corruption in how our electoral funding works. All of us have been aware of the nature of this game. And it is really based on how large institutions in India respond, statutory institutions, constitutional institutions respond to what I really like to believe is now a perpetual crisis in electoral funding in India. If the Supreme Court of India can fail us, as Dr. Chokar was saying, and I use the mildest possible term when I say this, I would like to use stronger terms. If it completely fails after acknowledging that this is a problem, that a crisis that's been created, what does an average citizen do? Where does he go or she go and ask for changes that are to be brought. When the election commission sits back after raising first flanks, when the Reserve Bank quietens down after the first raising some issues, red flags with the concern, if all institutions that are supposed to protect the nature of our democracy and the practice of our democracy fail the citizens, I don't think I want to blame the citizens for not having thought through. I think they're very well aware, and therefore you see an anger amongst them, you see a degree of skepticism and cynicism against them. But it's not that they're not bothered about it. Why would either one of us not be bothered that our elected MLAs, our Gram Panchayat leaders and our MPs are not more responsive to us? Clearly, we would want them to be. But we've set them in a set game where they have little options. Because I think a lot of us in positions of public spheres where we could have changed these things have failed them. We have failed our citizens. I don't think they've failed in questioning how our democracies function.
Thanks. Dr. Chokar, we've already got questions. Since we are getting close to our given time, let me pose this question to you from the audience. That now that electoral bonds are weaponized, what is the future? How can there be dissent? I suppose, how can there be reform? I mean,
I mean, I need to continue where Nitin left. And I'll come back to this. How can we correct this? The question was of choice. Do voters care where political parties get their money from? And mind you, this is wonderful that this is exactly the expression the learned Attorney General of India said in the Supreme Court hearing. He said, why do voters want to know where do political parties get their money from? They should only worry about where do candidates get their money from. And there was a kind of a sigh in the Supreme Court as to what has the gentleman said. Now let me give you an example. Nitin said that we supposedly vote for the government, or we elect the government. Do we really elect the government? And I would ask, if it were a more interactive session, I would ask, whom do we elect when we go to vote? And since we are running short of time, I will say we elect, or we don't even elect, we give one vote to one individual out of 6, 7, 8, 10. Where do those 6, 7, 8, 10 come from? And they come because they have been chosen by political parties. So I, as a voter, have no choice but to vote for one of the X number of people chosen by X number of political parties. One can say there are independent candidates. Yes, there are. But the interesting fact is that the number of independent candidates contesting the election has been going up, and the number of independent candidates getting elected has been going down. In the current Lok Sabha, there are about 3 or 4 independent members. Independents just can't win because they don't have the money to win. So, since all candidates effectively are chosen by political parties, my first proposition is that a voter's choice is pre-constrained by the choices made by a set of political parties. The voter doesn't have a choice. Her or his choice is pre-constrained by political party. Then, anyway, somebody votes and somebody gets elected. The person who is so-called an elected representative, does that person have a choice how to vote for a bill or against a bill in the parliament or in the state assembly? The anti-defection law forces a person to vote according to his party's wishes. Otherwise, her or his membership can be terminated. Proposition 2, the choice of a so-called elected representative is completely controlled by the political party. And if you put propositions A, 1 and 2 together, the answer is the government is formed by political parties, period. Let us say somebody gets elected as an MLA or an MP. You know, just before the election, she or he might come to your house and say, please vote for me. The day after getting elected, try and meeting your MP or MLA. You can't. Because the allegiance of an elected representative does not lie with the voter. It lies with the person who gave her or him the ticket. Because had the ticket not been given, nobody could have voted for that person. So it is the ticket giver who is the controller of our elected representatives. And who are the ticket givers? Somewhere it is a high command, somewhere it is a coterie, somewhere it is a supremo. So the basic problem is that none of our political parties is a democratically functioning entity. On the top, we have a vibrant democracy. We are all, I have lost all my hair saying vibrant democracy. But the political parties which supposedly run this democracy are completely non-democratic. And therefore, they need such ways of collecting money. Because if they were democratic, they would not need to hide where do they get their money from. Because money is not, the money that comes into a political party does not belong to the party. It belongs to a coterie in the party.
And then, of
therefore,
course,
the question was, what? Oh, sorry, I got distracted. Sorry. Political parties control everything. And in every constituency, there are only 2 or 3 candidates who are really possibly going to get elected. And if these 2 or 3 also have criminal cases pending against them, whom does a voter vote for? The voter has no choice while voting. The voter has no choice. Voter doesn't even know who gets what money. Voter feels that if I can get 2 or 3,000 during the time of election, let me get that. There is a Hindi saying which says, जब जब देश में चुनाव आता है, गरीब के पेट में पुलाव जाता है. राम नाम की लूट है, लूट सके जो लूट. फिर इलेक्शन आ जाएगा, फिर पुरान जाएंगे छूट. I mean, there is complete loot of public money, of my money, and Nitin said, this is our taxes. Corporates don't give their money. All big corporates are existing on public money. So voters do not have a choice. They are concerned, but they are completely helpless.
So thanks, Dr. Chokar. I mean, it just reminds me how the government went to town asking for, demanding to know who was sponsoring the farmers' protest near my place out here. That's the joke when you look at the kind of funding that goes into running an elections, and which is just to give the audience a sense of what we are talking about. I mean, there is no way I can corroborate it, but it was more than 50,000 crore, let's say, the last general election. That was the kind of money that we are talking about. So we are not talking about even a money that we can write it down. I don't know how many zeros comes to 20. Probably we'll have to wrap up here.
Can I add a bit to what you just said?
Yes.
The amount of money. In 2009 Lok Sabha election, there were 6,753 candidates. We decided to analyze the election expenditure affidavits of these candidates. 753. 4 candidates said that they had spent about no more than the limit, which was about 16 or 20, 25 lakhs. 30 candidates said they had spent about 90 to 95% of the money. So 6753 minus 34 is 6719, which is 99.9999 from Delhi to Imphal. Those people said that they spent only 45% to 55% of the limit. A chief election commissioner who was retired by then, he said, if this is the case, we should be reducing the limit and not increasing the limit. And at every election, there is a clamor to increase the limit. And it does not stop here. In the same 2009 election, a gentleman, I hate to say this, a person who was elected, unfortunately, he is also no more, became a minister. In a public meeting in Bombay, he said he had spent 8 crores on his election. His affidavit said 19.9 crores, 19.9 lakhs. So contrast this to the 50,000 figure or 30,000 or 60,000 which the Center for Media Studies estimated. I mean, with all regard to Dr. N. Bhaskar Rao, there is no basis for that. We just don't know how much money gets spent, because I would imagine 90% of the money gets spent unaccountably. And none less than Atal Bihari Vajpayee is on record having said that every parliamentarian begins his parliamentary career with a lie on election expenditure. So nobody can corroborate, don't worry about it.
Yes. Thanks, Dr. Chokar. Yes, for a long time in India's northeast, every government would use the cliche that insurgency is a cottage industry. Now, politics in that comparison is a large scale. It's not a cottage industry. It's
politics is heavy industry.
Heavy industry. So, Nitin, the question posed out here is that why hasn't traditional media, I suppose what they mean is mainstream within air quotes or legacy media, why hasn't that media explored the consequences of electoral bond scheme? Forget about consequences. I think they haven't even talked about electoral bonds. Even I belong to that media or belongs to that media, Nitin.
Well, it's simple one-line answer. They don't have the spine to. The fact that they are also reliant on advertisements from same corporates post-liberalization, that's been a growing and large amount of funding for legacy media organizations of all kinds. They just do not have the mandate to do it because they're answerable more to their advertiser than to their readers. And I think the emergence of independent media, which relies, say, like the Reporters Collective, on citizens who can afford to donate to make sure reportage and people like us are answerable only to them, is a fair ask. And I think that little has moved in that direction. They're pretty solid young organizations now in India which are trying to do it in a very difficult atmosphere. I think it needs to grow. I think 90s was another era. We are now in an era where large philanthropies, rich and middle class individuals in India, and I do mean middle class is a different genre than what most Indians trust and believe themselves to not to be part of. They do need to pay for journalism to be answerable to them, just as we want to make sure that our elected leaders are answerable to us as citizens. I will not paint a rosy-eyed, rosy-tainted image of what journalism was 30, 40 years ago, and it was spectacular, and suddenly that golden era is gone. I think it was always facing these challenges, but post-stabilization, facing the brunt of corporate power and corporate funding and the changing nature of business of journalism, it's got a little worse. In the last few years, it's got far worse. It's become extremely difficult to do this kind of investigative work with persistence and consistency both. One-off, it's possible. You can do one of these and go off into oblivion, claiming you did one good story in a lifetime. But for organizations and individuals to persistently do this kind of work, to not let go, as you say, all good journalism is being like a dog with a bone, pursuing it endlessly. That can only be possible if citizens really fund reportage, not opinion, not curation, not instant remix of existing information, but pure reportage in its sense. I mean, while I've had the great benefit of claiming very often, like on this forum, that I was one who was able to bring out large elements of what happened in the electoral bonds scheme. If you look back, actually, it was Commodore Lokesh Batra who put most effort. It was just an individual citizen, free of all encumbrances of surviving in a bad newsroom, who brought it out. I was just fortunate at that time to be in an independent space in the Reporters Collective, to be able to publish it with an independent organization that was fearless about business interests in India and was able to put it out. In multiple languages, we found partners to do this across the board. But if we want to see this kind of work grow, and it should grow, because again, answerability doesn't end at just getting votes and putting votes for candidates, is to hold them accountable to ask for what they do and don't do. We do need to build an ecosystem for journalism in India, and reportage. I keep insisting reportage and not just opinion writing, where we are held completely accountable to citizens, but we're also funded by citizens to do this work. Else, we are just another business, and journalism can't work as just another business.
Totally agree. I think Sainath had once was speaking to our students, and he requested them that if they could go and buy a mug of coffee for X amount of rupees, I'm sure that they could go and do the same to buy some news. I mean, we expect news coming to us free of cost to our rooms. I mean, somehow I think we're still not used to the idea of paying. I mean, the paywall still hasn't been successfully been exploited. The subscription model doesn't work very well, because we have almost an entitlement that, okay, news should be free coming to us without any payment, and yet we demand quality. And I think this message should go out to the audience with a request that please, unless you pay, you cannot or contribute, you cannot demand quality news, which is not misinformation or disinformation.
I mean, if I may add, Kishle, an overused analogy perhaps, but if you're going to pay peanuts, you're going to get monkeys doing your journalism for you.
Yes.
Can I,
Absolutely. Yes,
as a non-journalist, can I butt into this?
Yes, Dr. Choka, please.
Cozy conversation. My first question that I've been wanting to ask from the time Kishle asked you that question is, isn't the entire traditional or legacy media owned by big business? So how can we expect them to do anything else? And you are right, Nitin, journalism cannot run as any other business. And let me then submit that there are a few human endeavors that cannot run as normal businesses. And before journalism come health and education.
Absolutely.
You cannot run these things as a business, including journalism. I mean, they have a special place. Imagine if there was no news at all in the world. Would we know what is happening in Ukraine today? Would we know which political leader is violating the model code of conduct in which state today? So if we realize that education, health, and media and news are things which we cannot do without, and no human being can do without it. Therefore, they cannot be businesses, because the definition of a business, as Nitin said earlier, is to make a profit. These activities cannot run on making a profit. And therefore, we have to, break people into learning to pay for news. After all, the All India Radio used to be free except a radio license. And newspapers have always been subsidized by advertisements. But today, advertisements have taken over. We need to.
Yes.
It's a long story.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Chokar. I think we are running right out of time. For all intents and purposes, electoral bonds fail to provide the voter with any meaningful information that aids her in making more informed voting choices, which should be the fundamental, platform on which democracy really rests. That seriously challenges the transparency claim made by policy. But my takeaway line, of course, is what Dr. Chokar was saying about late Mr. Jaitley, saying that how anonymity and transparency will be ensured. I mean, this is the poetry of irony. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Nitin. Thank you, Dr. Chokar. And just to borrow what Nitin was saying, I think at the right time, or even if it's the wrong time, but at all times, I think we need to raise our voices and remind people, inform people of what's happening. And if people want, they probably will be able to. Change is going to be inevitable. But unless we identify the society's problems, unless we amplify those problems, there cannot be any action or any traction. I'm happy to report, Dr. Chokar, that while the number of independent MPs is going down in the parliament, the number of independent journalists is going up. So yes, on that note, thank you so much. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you for having us here. Thanks, Sharif.